pleased today to welcome Michael Barnett as well, actually not part of a series. We just brought you in as a one-off kind of thing, I think, I believe. Mike is university professor of international affairs and political science at GW. He's also the associate editor of International Organization, which, if you guys don't already know about it, is the leading journal in the IR field. He is the author of The Star and Stripes, A History of Foreign Policies of American Jews, which just came out this year and what he'll be presenting today. I looked at his CV before coming up here this afternoon and counted 8 single or co-authored books and 5 edited books and a boatload of articles and book chapters. So his CV is about 5 times as long as mine, and it's just incredibly impressive. I also wanted to add on a personal note that I'm especially delighted to have Mike here for 2 other reasons. First, he is my first, oldest, and best friend in political science. We first met on the first day of grad school. We were both first-year students at Minnesota in October '82, and we TA'd together our first class that very first quarter. And we shared an office throughout grad school. And after we graduated in '89, both of us, we used to talk for years, almost every day, but only when Mike called me. I never called him. And so this is sort of a chance to thank Mike for being more of a friend to me than I was to him all those years. So the other reason that I'm glad he's here is that when I first moved to Ohio State in 2004, Mike just casually mentioned to me that he had never been to Mershon. And every couple of years when I talk to him or see him, he mentions, he's never been to Mershon. And it became kind of a sore point. And so by finally acceding to his demand to come here, I've expunged this debt, and I don't have to ever hear about this again. But no, seriously, I'm really happy to have Mike here, and I'm sure it'll be a very interesting talk, so please join me in welcoming Mike Barnett. So.
Once again, you overwhelm me with your kindness. This is my clicker, right? This is the click thing. Okay. Thank you, Alex. I've missed you too. I think that's actually your way of saying I've missed you. Yeah. That's as close to a public display of affection as we'll probably ever see. Okay. Thank you. It's great to be here. And yeah, I actually have never been to Columbus, so.
Yeah, as you mentioned.
Are you going to do this the whole talk? Seriously? Yeah. Little Austin Powers. No, it's all good. Anyway, it's great to be here. What I'm going to do is talk about this book I wrote. It's a bit of a departure, I guess, from what I've been doing over the years. And so it's probably useful for me to actually say a little bit about its origins, but I want to talk broadly about the book, and then I'll give you maybe a little bit of a flavor of some of the empirics and how this kind of works out with some of the contemporary debates. But it's not I did notice I was under the critical IR series. It's not correct. Good. Okay, so I don't have to mention.
They don't consider me a critical, so you don't have to feel bad.
Seriously? Because otherwise, this is actually, you have to give me more than 40 minutes. Okay.
Doing this for 34 years, you guys.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind.
Okay. So, the origins of the book are actually driving my kids' carpool to religious school. Okay, so you should know there's a personal, as in all books, there's a personal element. Anyway, I'm driving my kids to, along with the neighbors' kids, not just mine. It's a whole carpool. It's not a great moment for me. And I drive up to the synagogue. This isn't back when I was teaching in Minneapolis. I live in Minneapolis. And I noticed something odd, which was the banner that used to hang above the door was gone. And that banner was used to be something like to the effect of Israel, we're with Israel in its struggle for peace and security. It's the kind of banner you see almost at any synagogue in America. It's not an unusual banner by any stretch of the imagination, and it was gone. And it had been taken down, and a new banner was up. This is back in 2006, 2007. Said, "Save Darfur." Okay, and at the time I was writing this book on humanitarianism and history of humanitarianism, and I was sort of getting into this question of the relationship between religion and humanitarianism. And so it sort of caught my attention because it seemed to be a bit of an evidence of faith-based humanitarianism in the American Jewish community. I'd actually spent a lot of time at that point thinking about Christian and Islamic humanitarianism, hadn't thought much about Jewish humanitarianism, and thought, oh, well, there's an expression of a different kind of faith-based humanitarianism. And I thought it was interesting, and part of it was, let's see if this works. This taps in, so the lights have to go out? Oh, I see. I thought you did that again. No. Okay. Well, as long as you're happy, then I'm happy. Okay. This seemed to be an expression of what was going on in the American Jewish community, which is something called Tikkun Olam, which is largely translated into repair of the world. And it has lots of different meanings, depending on what your translation is. But basically, this is understood as the term of art in the non-Orthodox community for thinking about social justice among Jews, largely directed at non-Jews. There are other terms to talk about sort of social action among Jews, but Tikkun Olam was the idea that Jews helping non-Jews, and it was increasingly a household term in the American Jewish community. And you could see that, as I sort of began to track these things, Google citations, number of organizations, the amount of money that was being given, organizations like the American Jewish World Service, which came out of nowhere and was increasingly on everybody's lips. It was really quite phenomenal in many ways. And so I was interested in this, and so for the first time began thinking about Jewish humanitarianism, but then also became somewhat energized by the fact that this expression of Tikkun Olam had gone up, but then this banner supporting Israel had come down. And this could be part of my overactive imagination, or it could be, an artifact of the fact that I'm driving carpool, and so you'll do anything to escape that horror. And I thought, well, this might be also related to another broad trend that I see in the American Jewish community, or I keep hearing about, which is what's called this growing distancing of American Jews from Israel. And there's a lot of debate about the data and whether there really is distancing going on, but for the most part, this is, whether the data supports it or not, there was this general feeling out there that American Jews are becoming increasingly distant from Israel. They would often point to the rise of J Street as an example. I happen to think that's the wrong interpretation of J Street, but nevertheless, there is a sense that the American Jewish community is increasingly uncomfortable with Israel, or is not as much in love as it used to be. I began to wonder whether, in fact, what might be the relationship between this rise of social justice and this distancing to Israel. Now, one possibility is that this really was an artifact of an overactive imagination, and that there's no relationship whatsoever. These are just simply trends that may be correlating. Social justice is going up, distancing from Israel is going up. And so, but there's nothing really to make of it. There's no connection. The other possibility is that Tikkun Olam is creating distance from Israel. It's crowding out Israel. There's only one banner that can go above the synagogue door. And so, you put one up, you take the other one down. It shows to some extent, not that American Jews are less enamored with Israel, but that they're really enamored with saving Darfur. And right now, that seems to be taking up all of their energy and their time. And so you've only can spend so much time doing these kinds of non-religious activities, and that becomes the way you go. The third possibility was that for whatever reason, American Jews are just simply uncomfortable with Israel. And as they try to begin to wonder how can they enact their identity in the world, you've got any number of possibilities available to you. You could do it the old-fashioned way, which is through Israel, but Israel raises a lot of moral problems for a lot of American Jews. As opposed to, let's say, going to Ghana and working and building schools for formerly trafficked children, going to Thailand and working with peasant populations, going to Nicaragua in an interfaith gesture and building schools in the countryside. I mean, there are all kinds of ways you can actually begin to be part of the world. And guess what? You don't have the same kind of uneasiness when you get back from Ghana that you do when you get back from Israel. It just feels better, and it becomes sort of a pure expression of one's Jewish identity. And as you know, and as one person said, I was attending this very weird seminar in Washington at this place called Six and I. That was, how do you handle your dysfunctional relationship with Israel? That was actually the title of the seminar, and it was over several weeks, and it was actually by people who had been veterans of Birthright, so who had gone on the trip to Israel as American Jews for 10 days and come back. And as she said, I can't wait to go to Israel, and I can't wait to leave. I mean, that seemed to sort of express a lot of the ambivalence that I was hearing among many, certainly youth in the American Jewish community. And I even heard, in terms of my interviews with people in the social justice community, that they felt actually that working in social justice, like going to Ghana, showed the world that Jews could be more than just simply occupiers, that it was important to have a counter-narrative, that Israel was giving Jews a bad name, and that by doing social justice work, they showed the world that Jews could be better than the Israelis. That's pretty severe, but that's kind of what I heard from, that was a little bit on the rough edges, but this is kind of what I was hearing from other American Jews. Again, granted, they were in the social Jewish organizations, so it's a biased group, but it was still nevertheless interesting. So I kept, and then there was this also the possibility that, in fact, that this relationship between the two could be explained by an underlying omitted variable, which could be, let's say, the weakening of the Jewish identity. So a weaker Jewish identity could translate into less attachment to Israel, and it could also mean that you're more attached to, let's say, interfaith and social justice work. Any of these things were possible, but I began to sort of, it became an obsession in my head, and I wanted to begin to sort it through. And I kept going back and forth in terms of different ways to think about the symbolism of one banner going up and the other banner coming down. And the way that I sort of came around to it was that this seemed to be a dance, if you will, between universalism on the one hand and particularism on the other. That there seemed to be something going on here in terms of how it is that American Jews wanted to express themselves in the world. And so I began to wonder, in the terms that I was using, in terms of the broader stuff I was doing on humanitarianism, was how do people come to define their obligations, duties, and responsibilities to others, especially others outside the community? Does the fact that the Darfur banners going up and the Israel banners coming down suggest that American Jews are, if you will, navigating their relationship to the world in different ways, moving from particular to the universal? These became the themes that I began to organize, and I settled on, essentially, if I want to tell you, so 3 layers to this dance between the particular and the universal. And I want to sort of go through those, and that's going to be the bulk of the talk. The first 2 layers will be the least important. The third will be on the American Jewish experience in particular, will be the most important. But I want to emphasize the extent to which this question of the tension, or how you manage the relationship between the particular and the universal, is something that is very sort of intrinsic almost to the Jewish experience. So that gives you a little bit about the roadmap for what's going to happen. Now, the first layer is just simply Jewish theology. There are any number of ways. Anybody who's a good, Talmudic scholar or a biblical scholar would be able to point to various verses in the Torah in which the theme of the particular and the universal become really pronounced. And in fact, some people would say that's the proper reading of the Torah, that this is actually really an attempt by Jews to sort of wrestle with those ongoing questions. And there are lots of expressions for capturing this. And you can find enough supporting one side versus the other, but one supporting on the particularistic side is that this is a people apart. This is the one from Numbers, a people that dwells alone. There is that sense then within Jewish theology that Jews are a separate people. And sometimes it has the pernicious, and this is the one that's been expelled from the American Jewish discourse, is a chosen people, which has any number of different possible meanings attached to it. But there is a sense of separateness. The other, though, is that an expression of universalism, that they are a light unto nations, that they are going to be a way of helping the world discover its own humanity, that the purpose of the Jews in this world is not to simply maintain the covenant with God, but to help humanity discover what it means to be at one with each other. And there are lots of different arguments that again get pulled through religious scholarship. In many ways, this might surprise you, I'm not a Talmudic scholar, I'm not a Bible scholar, I don't teach religious studies, and in many ways it's irrelevant to me because I do political science. I actually care about political behavior. And so, but I do think that what's significant here is the extent to which this is actually very much part of Jewish teaching and religious training. And, oh, that really skipped fast. Okay. But it does become part of politics. It begins to spill out of the yeshivot in Europe and into the streets, beginning in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And the reason why is that for the first time, the Gentiles decide that they actually might be able to have a more amicable relationship with the Jews. You begin to see the possibility of emancipation. And there's lots of things that are driving this, including the Enlightenment and other kinds of reformist thought. But what you begin to have now is the beginning of a conversation that's not just about Jewish theology. It really is about Jewish politics. How do you interact with other communities? And again, to emphasize, prior to this, there was no reason to have this debate because the Jews had no choice. The terms were settled. Well, once the emancipation begins to happen in places like France and Britain and in England, what you began to see was an interesting politics among Jewish intellectuals, both religious and lay scholars, about what should be the relationship between the Jewish community that's now coming out of the ghettos and the broader community. And it's taking place also in the backdrop of the emergence of the nation state. And so one of the interesting aspects, again, this is all part of the sort of process of, interesting things you discover during your research, was that in many ways the fundamental question that was confronting Jews at the time was how do a stateless people with a growing collective identity accommodate to themselves to a world increasingly organized around the nation state. This was a people that was increasingly seeing itself as a transnational political community, bound by religion, and at the same time was expected to integrate into the nation state. And in some places that was more possible than others. And different Jews had different ways, different Jewish communities had different ways of responding to this challenge, and in many ways it comes down to, I think, what one former Jew, Heinrich Heine, said, which is to understand the Jews, you have to begin with the Gentiles. So if you want to understand how the Jews adapt to that situation, first look at the broader environment in which they're embedded, and that's the Gentile community. And in fact, what you find is that where Jews were surrounded by exclusion, ethnic nationalism, and hatred, as they were oftentimes in Russia and Eastern Europe, they tended towards oftentimes ideologies of separation or in some ways a complete transformation, like socialism. But this was largely, there was no prospect for integration, so you found ideologies of retreat, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then in those countries and in those environments that were more hospitable, France, Germany, England, in which there was the emerging Enlightenment and emancipation was possible, you began to see Jews beginning to champion ideologies of inclusion, liberalism, democracy, separation of church and state. This is the push that they're taking. So Heinrich Reich, as far as I'm concerned, if you basically, as one, this is a derogatory, but from a 19th century Jew, each country gets the Jewish community it deserves, which is how they put it. And so again, what was informative was the extent to which different kinds of political ideologies begin to coalesce depending on the nature of the political environment. So they're doing this, though, at a time where there are two broader debates that are taking place transnationally. And so these debates are not simply domestic debates, they are increasingly transnational debates. And so part of what we need to understand is the extent to which what's occurring in Europe is actually part of a broader process of internationalism. It's part of that growing sense of transnationalism that we see among other communities. It's now beginning with the Jewish community as well. And they begin to organize politically and transnationally around two basic issues. One is what's called the Jewish problem, which is basically how do you keep the non-Jews from beating the hell out of the Jews? And that's basically the Jewish problem, which is that the Jewish problem is the fact that Gentiles have a problem with the Jews. And so how do you organize then to protect Jews? And so what you begin to see is the beginning of what is called self-defense organizations. How do you mobilize transnationally to protect Jews? And the other side is the Jewish question. This is what Marx wrote on quite famously and provocatively, not always in ways that are seen as flattering to the Jewish experience. But the basic question that Marx was asking was following on a lot of other Jewish intellectuals, which is how should the Jews exist in the world? What is their ultimate purpose? What's their role? Do they have a broader purpose? And the reason why these questions become possible now is because they're leaving the ghettos. They now have to interact with the wider world and are beginning to ask themselves, what is our purpose? And this is a term that's gone out of fashion, but what's our mission? What's our role in the world? What purpose do we serve? These are, as I've suggested, internationalized, and again, different Jewish communities have different answers to this. And a lot of it comes down to new forms of Jewish internationalism. Now, I use the term waringly because I realize the extent to which the idea of Jewish internationalism comes with a lot of baggage. And so for a lot of people, they immediately think of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Any notion of Jews organizing internationally oftentimes can lead to very insidious views. We can talk about that afterwards, but I want to suggest that basically Jewish internationalism, as responses to the Jewish problem, the Jewish question, took two different paths. One was nationalism, and you saw the nationalist response largely in Eastern Europe, and this was a response that basically said, you know what, it doesn't matter how much we try. This was Herzl's big revelation, right, from the Dreyfus trials of 1896. It doesn't matter how hard we try to integrate, we will never be accepted. And so the solution then is a form of nationalism. Jews begin to say that part of the reason why we're estranged is that we don't have a state of our own, a national homeland of our own. We need to go create one, not only for self-protection, but for self-fulfillment. And what you begin to have are new expressions of Jewish nationalism. Some of them get attached to a territory. Others, though, interestingly enough, become understood in diasporic terms, diasporic nationalism. And what you begin to see is this kind of interesting experiment that Jews begin to have with the nation-state system. I mean, there's a lot of creativity going on among Jews in the late 19th, early 20th century. The other side, though, is forms of cosmopolitanism. And as most of you know, there are many different versions of cosmopolitanism. Political theorists and comparative politics and cultural studies folks will debate these endlessly. My own sense is that basically this is, stripped down, this is a belief that our sentiments, identities, and obligations transcend existing political, cultural, and territorial borders. There are some versions that say this must lead to a political integration. There are others that say, no, we can have thin forms and we can keep our own political homeland and yet join in a broader kind of transcendental experience. And so there are different versions, and actually significantly Jews have tried to experiment with different relationships between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. They don't, like many people who sort of wrestle with the particular and the universal, they oftentimes refuse to think of it as either or. It really is a matter of how do you combine the two. And how do they settle it? Well, Emma Lazarus, who most of you know because her words are on the Statue of Liberty, right? Give me your homeless and tired and so forth. She wrote something else that didn't make it on the Statue of Liberty, which is, she said, with respect to the Jewish internationalism, the truth is that every Jew has to crack for himself this nut of his peculiar position in a non-Jewish country. I think that should have been on the Statue of Liberty. I don't think it would have probably had the same kind of resonance, but it would have been interesting as a possibility. And American Jews were no different. I mean, she was writing about the American Jewish experience. There's an adage followed by scholars of American Jewish history, and there's this big debate, just like there's a big debate about American exceptionalism, there's this big debate among Jewish scholars about American exceptionalism and whether America was truly an exceptional place, and how exceptional was it. And the kind of prevailing wisdom is that America was different. And it was different because it didn't treat its Jews as different. This made America different, and because of that, that made American Jews different than any other Jewish community in the world. They didn't have to tear down ghetto walls. They didn't have to rewrite legislation. They were starting in many ways in a new and relatively fertile process of experimentation. And the consequence was that American Jews found that it was possible for them to integrate. For them, the big challenge was not self-defense, but rather acceptance. How do we make ourselves fully part of the American body politic? And so it was a strategy of acceptance, by and large, as opposed to a strategy of separation. American Jews, and this is my takeaway line, emerged from the American experience much more comfortable with universalism and cosmopolitanism than any other Jewish community in human history. That's a bit of a strong argument, but let's say the last 200 years. How's that? This becomes important for understanding what I argue is in terms of the American Jewish identity. And it's twofold. And both of them have, and both aspects of them are profoundly constituted by the American Jewish experience. And again, none of this is original. A lot of this is fairly standard in the broader literature of American Jewish history, but it's, I'll give it a slight twist in a moment when we look at the foreign policy side. But the American Jewish identity largely, again, not assuming it's fixed, I mean, these are fluid categories, is defined by liberalism and what I call the prophetic tradition. The liberalism is a liberalism that came from Europe in many ways. Originally, it was a liberalism of equality, autonomy, freedom of conscience. Jews began pushing hard for essentially moving against tradition and all things within society that was seen as conservative and forcing people to stay within their station. They wanted a degree of mobility. A lot of it was actually making sure that there, unlike in Europe, there was a clear separation of church and state. These were liberals through and through, and this is, and later they become the liberals associated with progressive thought. And it's that, there's this famous line I used earlier by Milton Himmelfarb that said, this is hardwired because Jews continue to vote like Puerto Ricans, but earn like Episcopalians. Okay? They're not voting their economic interests. This is bizarre. And he thinks they should. The other big part of American Jewish life is it becomes fertile ground for non-Orthodox Judaism. There's a lot of, and part of this is consistent with the broader religious experimentation we see in the American society. This is a place where you actually can experiment. There are no hardened traditions. There are no religious authorities that actually can clamp down the way you had in Europe. And so what you had was a lot of experimentation. In fact, there are a lot of rabbinical authorities who moved from Europe to America precisely because they don't have to deal with rigid communities. They can actually experiment and try out new ideas. This is where Reform Judaism doesn't begin in the United States, but it's certainly fertile ground. Conservative Judaism begins as a movement in the United States, and these continue to play a very, very important role. And I'm sure may get questions about the Orthodox community. It's still around 12%, so not important. It's still important and maybe a growing piece of the American Jewish community, but still not as significant as what we see in other parts of the community. What American Jews begin to do is begin to grapple with sort of how are we going to be Jewish in America. And one of the, this, again, I don't want to make it too derogatory, but basically what the struggle is for a lot of Jews in America and those who are trying to integrate is how do we be Jewish but not too Jewish? How do we fit in? What manners and customs should we keep? Which ones should we turn away? What should we adopt from our Christian neighbors to make us seem more familiar? And so there's a lot of experimentation that goes on within American Jewish life. And part of the way this combines, I argue, the political and the religious is what I call a political theology of prophetic Judaism. And the reason why it's prophetic is that, and this is critical to the argument, is that religious communities, as they form, can draw from any parts of their own religious traditions. A religious community like the Muslims or the Christians or the Jews have hundreds, if not, in some cases, millennium of sayings, traditions, prayers, customs, rituals that they can draw on. Which ones are they going to adopt? Or to use a term, which one becomes our usable religion? Which ones do we take? And what happens in the United States is that one of the ways in which non-Orthodox Jews begin to mobilize is around the prophetic tradition. That prophetic tradition is the tradition that is, as understood, that basically talks not about the Jews as a tribal people, but as a universal people. This is the tradition of all the prophets, including Isaiah, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. This is the light unto nations. This is the Judaism that begins to suggest that it's important for Jews to imagine themselves not as a people apart, but as part of a broader community. The prophetic tradition is the part of Judaism that emphasizes not rituals, but ethics. And what you begin to see in American Jewish life is the extent to which people become actually more comfortable understanding about civil rights than they do about safeguarding the Sabbath. There was a moment where one commentator, and I went back and looked just to check the American Jewish Committee's yearbook, spent more time on civil rights than on Israel in the 1950s. Okay, and this is about how do you express your Jewishness, and for a lot of Jews, it becomes part of doing good in the world. And this is the way you express your Jewish identity and begin to see themselves as a model for a better world. This is the part that gets emphasized. This has a political dimension to it. Okay, I'll stay there. This has a political dimension to it, and that political domestic dimension to it is what we understand to be sort of what are called, more traditional Jewish values, which we associate with sort of progressive politics. And still today, we were talking about this earlier, what we find is that, over at least the last, certainly more than half century, American Jews continue to be democratic. This is the thing that Himmelfarb was complaining about and Norman Potthurst was complaining about. Why are Jews stuck with being liberals? Can't they actually get it that they need to move somewhere else on the political spectrum? And they become associated with all kinds of progressive politics, welfare politics, civil rights, human rights at home. I mean, this is sort of how Jews try to present themselves in many ways as a hope for integration and a particular kind of American experience. This also has, and this is maybe the only novel part of the argument, I think, this also has an international dimension. This is the foreign policies. These are basically foreign policy beliefs and sensibilities. The first is that, and there are two important elements to the way it is that this prophetic theology becomes projected onto the world. The first is essentially an externalization of their strategy of integration and acceptance domestically onto the international stage. What's the corollary? Things like human rights, international law, international organizations, humanitarianism. This slide on the left is actually a slide of representatives, mainly of the American Jewish Committee, but of others from European Jewish delegations who are at the League of Nations. And, I don't want to give them too much credit, but they kind of single-handedly wrote the International Minorities Treaties. They played a very, very important role. They played a very important role in making sure that the beginning of some vision of rights became part of the League of Nations. Why? Because they thought that was the best way to protect Jews abroad. This was their strategy of projecting the way it is that they wanted to be seen, but also they thought integration was the path towards Jewish survival in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. The picture on the left is from the heads of the American Jewish Committee with Dag Hammarskjöld looking at the UN Declaration of Human Rights. A bit of a controversy here about what role the American Jewish organizations played in making sure that human rights became a part of the UN. But there's no doubt that they played an important role. Some would, I think, go too far and say if it wasn't for the American Jewish Committee, some other American Jewish organizations, human rights would have been left out of the UN Charter. That's, I think, a bit of an exaggeration. But there's no doubt that they were important interest groups in making sure that human rights gets a place at the UN. The other side, and this was the part that I find equally interesting, but this is sort of liberal internationalism as we understand it, Wilsonianism on a global stage. This was good for Jews at home, and it would be good for Jews and the world. The second element, though, is that, remember, they're attracted to forms of cosmopolitanism and integration, and that leaves them then with a wariness of various ideologies that preach separation and exclusion. They're worried about that. They don't want to be seen as being what we would now call as too nationalist. Because if you're too nationalist, it suggests that, maybe the Jewish problem is a Jewish problem. Maybe Jews just can't get along with other people in the world. Maybe, and this is a moment where a lot of American Jews, for them, the big thing is acceptance. You don't gain acceptance at home in what you think is your golden land by saying we're a diasporic people that need to move from our position of exile back to the homeland. Doesn't work that way. And so what you find is a lot of anxiety among American Jewish leaders, especially at the turn of the century, that are really, they're putting Zionism on the enemy's watch list. They don't have a good thing to say about Zionism. They are as harsh as you can believe. Now, one of the, there's lots and lots of pieces of evidence to this extent. One of the interesting ones is when Britain announces the Balfour Declaration. Okay, it's in November of 1917. The American Jewish Committee, which is, at that point, you can think of as the American Jewish Establishment. It's the premier American Jewish organization in the United States. Takes 6 months to decide how to respond. Why? Because the leadership is largely anti-Zionist. They actually don't think this is going to help the Jewish cause at home. They're worried about this. But the Balfour Declaration seems to suggest is what anti-Semites have always said about the Jews, which is that they are a people apart. And so when they issue a declaration, they say, this comes 6 months afterwards, they reiterate that their stated purpose is to obtain for the Jews in every part of the world civil and religious rights to protect them against unfavorable discrimination and to secure for them equality of economic, social, and educational opportunity. They also go on to say that it should be a homeland for the Jews without prejudice to the inhabitants. Why? Because they can't imagine arguing for Jewish exclusivity in Palestine and the principle of non-discrimination in the United States. You can't square that circle. You can't argue that all are created equal except when Jews get to Palestine. That becomes a difficult argument to maintain. And just in case anybody worries about issues of dual loyalty, they punctuate it by saying, and America is our homeland. Full stop. This is after 6 months of debate. This is as far as they can get. And a few years later, when there's hearings at Congress to debate the British Mandatory Authority and incorporate the Balfour Declaration to the League of Nations, they're still there arguing against it. It's kind of, we sort of imagine Congress in the role of AIPAC, and then you go back and look what the American Jewish Committee was saying in Congress, and you got to go, wow, this is not what I was led to believe. This is a very, very different kind of relationship. So the book, okay, so now we can turn this off. We can put the lights up and you can rise from the dead. What the book then tries to do is talk about this balance between cosmopolitanism and nationalism among American Jews since the mid-19th century to the contemporary period. And I argue that there have been, several distinctive periods. There's a period up until World War I where it was clear that American Jews were arguing in favor of a universal or cosmopolitan vision and arguing against any form of nationalism or particularism. They slowly get comfortable to various forms of Jewish nationalism during the interwar period, but they make it clear, and I didn't talk about the details of what the American Jewish Committee said they would want, but they wanted America, a Rockwell painting in Palestine. They wanted their idea of what a great Midwestern experience would look like in the Middle East. After World War II and the Holocaust, the shocking thing in many ways, in retrospect, is the extent, and then with the birth of Israel, was that American Jews actually didn't care that much. There's a little bit, there's a lot of excitement in 1948, but if you look at the data, there's not a lot of data to suggest that there's this overwhelming surge of passion by American Jews. 1967 to 1990, that's when we get now the conventional wisdom of American Jews falling in love with Israel. This becomes an interesting period which we can talk about. I want to leave time for questions and comments, but this is the moment when American Jewish tribalism, as I call it, begins to heighten. Never fully pushes out cosmopolitanism. But what you begin to see then, for a lot of interesting reasons, is that American Jews, for the first time, begin to identify, not just simply support Israel, but their identity begins to be formed in and around Israel. It's not just, do you feel passion for or an attachment? It's, is this part of what it means for you to be Jewish? This is what a lot of the data shows us. And this is novel. This did not happen before 1967. And then beginning in the 1990s, as I talked about it, we begin to see a beginning moment where there's a lot more hesitation that really is not so much about Israel. I should say it is about Israel, but it's about Israel in a variety of ways that has that relationship to what's going on within the American Jewish identity because of what's taking place at home. And let me just take 2 minutes to close by talking a little bit about this period. There is, I think, and part of my argument is the importance of the American historical experience or the domestic context for understanding the foreign policy beliefs of this transnational people. And so consistent with that, when I look at, let's say, what's happening with American Jewish identity, I look primarily at home. What's going on in American politics? And part of it, I do think, has to do with a weakening of the American Jewish identity. Part of it has to do with new experimentations of how to be Jewish. I jokingly say now you can be Jewish by doing high holiday services on your yoga mat. I mean, there are any number of ways in which you can express your Judaism in very interesting, dimensions. There is also what's called a return to a search for meaning, which could be seen as a rejection of their parents' Judaism, which was seen as overly focused on two things, Israel and the Holocaust. So this is idolatry. It's not really a lot of meaning. This is basically a story of suffering and victimhood, which is increasingly rejected by the young generation of Jews. And they want something more meaningful in their lives. They want a little joy. And so they begin to actually think about what they see as a more authentic term, more local communities. They begin to think more about Jewish day schools, Jewish education. I mean, there's a lot that's being piled in now at the local level, and it's not as focused on Israel, which is, important to the story. And lastly, Israel. I haven't talked about the relationship between American Jews and Israel much, but it does play an increasingly important role now, beginning in the 1990s. And it has to do, I argue, with the perception of American Jews about how do Israeli values stack up to theirs. And I've already talked about within the American Jewish identity, sort of liberalism, non-Orthodox Judaism, and that kind of prophetic theology. These are not the values of Israel. That if you look at the kind of values that are constitutive of American Jewish identity and break them down, you don't find them really they're not as easily found in Israel. Separation of church and state. There is no history of religious pluralism in Israel. It doesn't exist. Israel, according to various measures, ranks somewhere below the Sudan in terms of religious pluralism. That's probably, that's not how people like to think about it in this country. Human rights, or rights and the rule of law. Well, American Jews like civic nationalism. Israel is not organized around civic nationalism. This is ethnic nationalism. This is about a Jewish state. And there are a variety of, everyday informal expressions and also legal rulings that are designed to make sure that while there's civic and political equality, that in many ways, this is a Jewish state. It has to mean something about being Jewish. And that means if you're not Jewish, you don't get to share in the same ethnic dimension. And then democracy, as we know, there's that the so-called demographic time bomb, where at some point, assuming there's no withdrawal from the territories, sometime in the next 10, 20 years, demographers debate, there will be more non-Jews between Mediterranean and the Jordan than there will be Jews. What happens? And American Jews have essentially defended Israel on the basis of democracy and liberal values. It's not only been about a life raft. It's not just simply an escape hatch in case things really turn dark. Israel was supposed to stand for something. And what I think we're seeing in the distancing is not an opposition, but this is I keep coming around to this deepening ambivalence. It's a deepening ambivalence about where American Jews stand vis-a-vis Israel because of a fundamental concern that in many ways Israel's values don't reflect their own. And I would say historically what we've seen, going back now over a century of American Jewish discussion over Jewish nationalism, is that what American Jews want is a nationalism that looks like it's one that's consistent with their own. This is not what has emerged, and so at least from their perception, not what's emerging in Israel. And so when I think back about what was going on in, with that banner exchange, again, hyperactive imagination, but I do think it's symbolic of what has been going on about this ongoing tension in the American Jewish community about how to find what is a reasonable balance between particularism and universalism, and this has been an ongoing debate. The reaction of what's going on at home, but also what's going on abroad. Let me close there. I think I've, even taking into account your heckling, I think I've closed in 40 minutes. So,
do you want to take your own questions, or
whatever the format is?
kind of both ways. My inclination would be like to take your own questions. Is that all right with everybody else?
If you could also just identify yourselves. Alex, identify yourself.
Alex. The other Alex. So I think there might be you laid out these all sort of alternative explanations in the beginning for why the banner got switched. Maybe another one, maybe it falls under one of your categories.
Okay.
Maybe it's distinct, which is, could it be that there's a growing sense that Israel can take care of itself? So Israel's just as important, but apparently doesn't need support from the United States the same way it used to be. I guess this was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The banner got switched. But nowadays, and we talked about this earlier, if the Prime Minister of Israel has the luxury of being able to come over here and confront the president and sort of meddle, and apparently he's not that concerned about U.S. support. So maybe just that idea.
Yeah, no, it does. No, I'm glad you raised it. It doesn't actually fit. I acknowledge in the book it wasn't one of the first things I went to in terms of the four possibilities, but that is an alternative explanation that takes the following form, which is that right now what you've seen is that Israel got to a point where, as you say, it doesn't need help. And so when you look at, let's say, American Jewish giving, for instance, one would anticipate that Jewish giving might go down, and you don't have to be as anxious about Israel's survival. You might be more anxious about American Jewish survival at home, especially given the weakening identity. It also might be that, and this is the other part that I found interesting, is that, and I have a chart, which for me, I think it's a great chart. I usually don't like data. But this is a chart that shows the percentage of Jews that live in liberal democracies. Now, one of the interesting things is that, it's been a complete flip over the last century. So we're used to the demographics and seeing the extent to which Jews have moved from Eastern Europe and Russia elsewhere, but there's a political dimension to that, which is that they're now in liberal democracies. So they actually don't need as much help anymore. You could argue that in the last real attempt to gather was not just the Soviet Jews, but the Ethiopian Jews. And there are no more big pockets of Jews anymore for ingathering, unless, of course, you're reading commentary and you say, we have to save the French Jews. Now, that's a different argument, but there is that argument out there. And as a consequence, then you have time to help, to begin to help other people. And you don't need to help Israel as much. So social justice is actually a sign of strength. It's a sign that, in fact, things are actually pretty good for the Jews in a way that they weren't before. And that's I think that's part of it. I think it's actually, again, I think that's part of the explanation. But what we see though is that whatever turn there was in terms of the end of the big movements for the ingathering of the Jews, it doesn't seem to be correlated with the ebbs and flows of American Jewish support. There still seems to be a lot of variation. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a more of an empirical question. You said that between 1996 and 1990s, starting from 1966, I think the creation of AIPAC, etc.
Okay.
So 67 war.
Okay, yeah.
Israeli wars, etc. So it's almost as if during that period, the American Jewish identity was informed by external events, whereas in the other two periods, before 67 and after, it was more really the result of civic culture and what was happening in the United States. So is this a more instrumental type of...
Yeah, no, well, there's an instrumental argument here that I try to work through, and I don't have an answer, and I'll tell you about the instrumental argument in a second. But in terms, there's also stuff going on in 67. I mean, 67 is really interesting because part of it is an exogenous shock. I mean, as we think about, 67 doesn't just reshape the Middle East. It actually reshapes the relationship between American Jews and Israel. I mean, it becomes a very different moment after 67. And, but I think part of that is that you could begin to see some changes that were taking place that were feeding in that direction. But clearly the 67 war was a shock. What were the things that were taking place? Well, one people have argued that, part of what's going on is that American Jews are just more comfortable in their own skin. Before, they maybe were a little more reluctant to express their Jewishness in public. They wanted to sort of keep low. But there has been a process of integration. You could begin to see it in terms of which philanthropies you could belong to. I mean, you don't have to belong to exclusively Jewish philanthropies. You can join, you can become part of the board of the local symphony. I mean, in art museum, things become open to Jews in ways that weren't before. And so it becomes easier to express your Jewish identity without having to fear that there will be a backlash. I mean, I think there's the emergence of multiculturalism with various kind of identity movements so it becomes possible now to express your identity without having to worry about the same challenge of integration. So part of that has to do, again, with American Jews feeling more secure and more integrated so that they feel like they can express themselves. There's also, at that point, and this is external, there is a fundamental change in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. This is when, I would say that's when the special relationship begins. And so it now becomes possible for American Jews to be pro-Israel and not have to worry about being seen as un-American. Fighting for Israel is the same thing as fighting for America in that broader view. But there are also different things. Part of the 67 experience was that, I don't know how to put it, but American Jews finally begin to realize what they may lose. They hadn't really quite appreciated, this is, the stories that get told, hadn't quite appreciated what it meant for Israel to be there and how important it was, and you only realize it when you're close to losing it. So once they almost lost something, that's when they begin to realize that they really need it. There are other arguments out there that say Israel made them feel proud in ways they hadn't felt proud before. I'm of that age. I remember American Jews now putting on large stars of David, wearing Israel military paraphernalia. There's a greater assertion in ways that we hadn't seen before. And so all these things are beginning to take place that I think make it possible and acceptable and desirable for American Jews now to associate with Israel. And it also coincides with something I mentioned, which is the discovery of the Holocaust. And so it's that narrative that brings together, very powerful destruction and redemption. And that was already in place in 48, but boy, that now gets solidified. Rick?
I'm curious, you talk about American Jews as a unified group in the last 2 to 3 time frames. And one of the things that I was curious about get a lot of media coverage. And it looks like, at least from the outside, that maybe the Jewish community on some of these issues are pretty divided among themselves, more so than in the past. Is that true or not?
I was talking a bit about, Donald probably has opinions. I was talking about this with Herb as well before the talk. And then if you want to join in and offer your views on this too. Here's my take on this, is that still in terms of voting behavior, American Jews still vote pretty consistently Democratic. It's pretty secure. And their values tend to line up pretty well along with the Democratic Party. And then there's one little issue that seems to, sort of push them over to the Republican side, and that's support for Israel. But Israel remains, I think, from my viewpoint, there's still a bipartisan consensus. If bipartisanship, we mean support on Congress, that really does, that I think is solid. I actually don't see, there's that fear of partisanship, I don't see it. I think what's happening, though, in the American Jewish community, from what I can see, is that, and this goes along with my argument, is that the support for, if you think the support for Israel is becoming diminished, and it's becoming increasingly limited to a smaller but very passionate and wealthy American Jewish constituency. Okay, they vote on one issue, and they vote on Israel, and they're the ones that and as we know, and they're like the NRA, right? They're ready to mobilize, and they're going to judge everybody based on where you stand on Israel. For the vast majority of Jews, and this is what the Pew Survey of American Jews tells us from 2013, and other surveys I've seen, is that most American Jews put Israel somewhere 8th, 9th, 10th in terms of the issues that they care about. And so most American Jews are just not going to be mobilized around issues of Israel. So they're not going to find themselves getting into the same headaches with AIPAC that some people still do, like J Street. But rather what you see is there's some who are on J Street side, and then the other part of the surveys that I've seen, and again, I think the data is speculative, is that a lot of Jews are just indifferent. I think there's a growing percentage of American Jews that just don't care as much. And some of it's embarrassment, but a lot of them is, and some of it may be Jewish identity weakening, but a lot of it is they found other ways to express themselves. It's just not something that engages them in the same way. And so I think what's left, and this is the Peter Barnett argument, is what's left is a very small, very well-organized and well-oiled American Jewish establishment that has the ability to control what is sort of seen as, this American Jewish position on Israel. And this is where I do agree with Barnett, which is that it captures, I think, some of what's going on. But there's this other, I think, dimension of American Jewish patterns that makes that part, I think, from the broader spectrum, a little bit of a bubble. Don, you wanted to add?
Something I was going to comment on, Bruce, in between what Greg and you were saying. I think you've nailed it, and it's part of the answer to what Rick's talking about when we talk about tribalism versus cosmopolitanism. Because let me give you, I think, I have to two things people here, but after 3 decades as effective members of the science here, I spent the last little over a decade being a CEO of nonprofits in the Jewish world, and before I assumed both sides of what we're talking about here. And it strikes me, in the last 2.5 years in Canada, the comparison of Canada and the United States gives me some real interesting insight into why your categories are perfect.
Yay! Yay me!
Here's my hypothesis. It is, and it's an empirically based one, I've been observing for a while now, that the more insular the socialization of anybody who's Jewish in North America, I'm going to expand it for you for a minute, the much more likely it is they are to be tribal in their views of these topics, which includes Israel. The more that someone has grown up in an area where you're interacting with everybody in the world, and there's some of those people who are Jewish, the more cosmopolitan one becomes. And that latter one leads to more of an ambivalence or a complex relationship with Israel, where the former one this Israel is the crucial aspect of what it is to be Jewish. And where I've seen that in most substantially, in the United States, we tend to say, well, the group that is by far the most insular and is most tribal is the Orthodox Jewish community, okay? But I just spent the last 2.5 years in Toronto, and I moved throughout Canada, and what's really interesting, the Jewish community in Canada and the United States differ tremendously, and that there's much more of a bubble around the Jewish community. People live in the same area, even if they are Reform or conservative Jews. Okay? And lo and behold, my argument is it's not the formal belief as to what type of Judaism, but it is the separation from the rest of the society that leads to tribalism, which happens both in the Orthodox community in the United States, and it happens very much in almost all communities in Canada. Okay? And it literally predicts sort of 90%. I've just been running through, we've been talking through this. 90% of the interactions I've had in the last decade are really verified by what you're talking about with tribalism and cosmopolitanism, based upon where the residential patterns of the interaction with the rest of society become. So right, you're right, you're absolutely right, but those are the determining factors, in my view at least. That's the hypothesis I put forward.
Yeah.
Hi, Amy Schweitzer in philosophy. Forgive me for asking you maybe a philosophical question.
Oh, no, okay.
But I have maybe 3 parts to the question, or maybe 3 separate questions, so
Okay.
forgive me. So one is, it seems like there's a way in which your argument suggests that the BDS movement should be increasingly less controversial within the Jewish community, and I find that a little puzzling, so I wanted to know a little bit about that. And that actually, for me, took me to your categories about this distinction between universalism and particularism, and again, I'm a philosopher, so I'm thinking of like a Habermasian civic or sort of patriotic constitutionalism, right, or constitutional patriotism. So here the thought is that it's a love of law, patriotism understood not as love of blood or love of country, but love of laws. And it's a weird kind of it's a different kind of particularism than nationalism. It's a particularism that's about love of these laws, right? It's love of the U.S. Bill of Rights, right? Love of the Second Amendment, for instance, or something like that. But it seems to sit maybe a little bit in between this distinction you want to make between universalism and particularism, or it's a different kind of particularism than nationalism. And so I guess my question is there space for a Jewish constitutional patriotism?
Oh, my gosh.
Why or why not? So there's a way of coming to love the particular laws that are in the United States, or a way to come and love the particular laws that are in Israel, that's not about love of blood, love of people, but love of the laws that embody a certain kind of civic tradition. Anyway, so
Yeah. Was there a third? I mean, you said were there 2 in that? That's enough for me, right? Yeah.
there is a third, but I'll talk about it.
Okay. I honestly, I don't know what to do with that last question. Okay. I have to think. I'll have to think about it more. I sort of get what you're saying, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the early American Jewish leaders who also happen to be lawyers. A lot of them were lawyers, and a lot of them were well known for their love of law. And in many ways, that love of law came before. I mean, I'm thinking of people like, not Brandeis, his nemesis. There was, I'm blanking here.
Blackman?
No, this is someone in the American Jewish community.
Oh.
Anyway, but for him it was law itself, and you see that romance, I think, among what I've seen for a lot of American Jews at that time. So there might be something here with, I think, the particularism of laws, although it's hard for me to understand what that would mean without devoid of content.
Like I said, it's like the love of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Right? It's the love of the right to bear arms. That there's something about the American experience that makes us cherish this right, not as a universal right, not the thought that everybody in all parts of the world should claim this as a right or that it has meaning, but like in the American context, it has this particular meaning. And you might say that that's a similar kind of case in lots of people in Germany. That's what Habermas was talking about.
Yeah.
Lots of people in Germany
I've got to think. I mean, I obviously I'm squirming for an answer, and I have to think about it more. And I enjoy talking to you about it afterwards. On the BDS, why would you think my prediction would say that American Jews would be more comfortable with the BDS movement?
Oh, well, my thought was is that there's a lessening of an attachment to Israel, and so you might think that would
I see.
open the door
Yeah.
to thinking that actual pressure should be placed on Israel. I mean,
Yeah.
I find it counterintuitive that you would go there, but
Okay, so two-part response, one particular, one more general. On the particular side, I think part of it has to do with what is the constitution of the BDS movement and what is it? And there it's a matter of debate about who owns the BDS movement, what its label is, what it signifies. I have a very close friend and colleague of mine in anthropology who's a member, who's been part of this movement for a while, and she's made it very clear that her goal is the delegitimation of Israel. I mean, so BDS is not about settlements, it's about basically delegitimating Israel. And you don't have to spend a lot of time, I don't think, in some BDS circles without picking up on that. And I think that makes a lot of American Jews very uncomfortable. It's not necessarily an easy place to express your own anxiety about certain things about Israel. And so it goes beyond settlements. I mean, a lot of the BDS movement is really beyond necessary settlements. There is also, and then there's the interesting Weiner-Walzer line, which basically says, not boycott, not divestment, but sanctions. So let's just take some of the, take 1/3 of BDS. The general argument, though, and this is another feature of the book, which I had to sort of really wrestle with a lot, and this is the American Jewish relationship to human rights. I find it very complicated. And one of the ways I originally began to formulate the question was, okay, so 100 years ago, American Jews were on the forefront of international human rights. They felt like they owned it, not they owned, but that they actually identified with it. And they were proud of that relationship. And with the UN, they actually celebrated, they took too much credit, but they celebrated their relationship to the UN Charter. Now, of course, if you're a member of the American Jewish establishment, you can't go near human rights. Human rights is a dirty word. You just can't do it. And what you saw, and part of it has to do with, what happens, I think, with the human rights movement more broadly, how it gets owned, what happens when it moves from apartheid to Israel. And so I've heard a lot of American Jews within the human rights organizations who've said, we didn't abandon human rights abandoned us. We tried at various times, for instance, to get them to take seriously anti-Semitism, and they said those are rich people's problems, or those not a real problem, and so we're not going to worry about that. It also means that you have to associate, a lot of that human rights rhetoric could be seen as delegitimating Israel. And so some of the most interesting conversations I've had is with people in the American Jewish community who are trying to, stake out a position on human rights vis-a-vis Israel. But they tell me this is impossible. That the first thing they need to do when they talk about their defense of human rights is that doesn't make them anti-Israel. And the corollary of that is that if you can't actually express your universalism through human rights, and this was part of what I picked up in terms of where I came from in humanitarianism, then where do you do it? Because you can't do it through human rights anymore. You do it through social justice. You do it through charity work and development and through, gender empowerment and emergency relief. But what's interesting, AJWS wouldn't touch the rights word until a few years ago. That most American Jewish, Tikkun Olam organizations stayed away from it. And part of it was they didn't want anything to do with Israel. The big debate in a lot of these social action groups is American Jews seem to care about everybody but Israel. That's the blowback. And so the question then becomes for me, what expression of cosmopolitanism? there are multiple cosmopolitanisms that have multiple kinds of political projects. Which one do you identify with? And that's the more general argument. So, and there are other arguments I got from people in the Jewish organizations saying, well, we do, Judaism talks the language of justice. We don't talk the language of rights and things like that. But I think there's some political answer to this. You wanted to?
Yeah, I guess my question kind of follows up directly on this.
And you are?
My name is Alex W. And I guess I guess I'm struck by the fact that your narrative is in terms of particularism versus universalism, cosmopolitanism, and so on. But there's a third term that you haven't mentioned, and a proper noun that you've never mentioned. And the proper noun you've never mentioned is Palestinians. And the third term in this equation seems to me to be empire. And if there's an ambivalence since 1990 in the Jewish community in the United States, I'm wondering how much of that is driven by Israeli policies toward the Palestinians and a feeling that Israel has become an empire of some kind, and is unwilling to relinquish that empire. And so I guess my counterfactual hypothetical question is, if the Palestinian problem were solved, let's say tomorrow, miraculously, how would that change American Jews' attitude in terms of particularism, universalism spectrum? Would that allow them to start talking about human rights, for example? Would that push them toward a more cosmopolitan view? Or, I guess I'm wondering what the implication of that kind of a solution would be. Obviously, there's the whole Mideast issue more largely, which is very difficult and so on. But I think the Palestinian issue, if there's an ambivalence today, it's because of the Palestinians,
Yeah.
it seems to me.
That's a big part of it. And I think, part of it has to do, I think part of it has to do with this question of the relationship to the Palestinians. You don't hear the language much of empire. At least I don't hear in Israeli circles. I hear a lot about, occupation, right?
That's apartheid.
Apartheid and things like that. And I think this is certainly something that's it's certainly deeply troubling to most American Jews. And I think one of the other troubling factors, and this is actually part of a broader debate, is the extent to which those attitudes have also seeped into Israeli political culture. So it's not just simply about, it's no longer, this is where things get kind of, increasingly blurry. It's not just about Israeli attitudes towards the other, the Palestinian, but there's also still this very large minority that is increasingly calling itself Palestinian, and that you still can't really integrate in any kind of effective way because you're an ethnic nationalist society. So I think that's always been there. I think, as you rightly say, that, what opened the whole thing was 1967, and it created a new set of dynamics that otherwise wouldn't have been in place, because these issues, the way you can play the counterfactual is ask where were American Jews from 48 to 67, when you didn't have the questions of occupation, and there was a lot of indifference, but it didn't raise the same kind of issues. But I still think that you're right to say that if, in fact, if you ask me to predict, we know what's going to happen. It's already a one state. Okay, that's my view. It's already a one state. This is, forget two-state questions. It's already a one state, and the question is, what kind of one state are we going to be looking at now? But I do think that becomes an important dimension, is the question of Palestine. I will say that, there is this kind of interesting argument. I sort of mentioned the liberal internationalism. I just have to say, because part of the French Jewish argument during the 19th century in republicanism was a form of empire. That what they argued was, in fact, the way to protect Jewish communities. The whole, was, especially in North Africa, was to argue in favor of that civilizing mission. And the belief was that civilizing mission was an expression of your republicanism. It was an anti-ecclesiastical position against the French Catholic Church. And it was also then a way of expressing your French identity. And it was a way then of actually creating empire. And so there has been, Zionism has been bound up with this. And it's not something that's easily untangled. And, when I look at, let's say, if you, some of the more so it's not, so you can find some versions of French empire that were very consistent with a Jewish cosmopolitanism and protection of Jewish communities. a very interesting set of relationships historically. You had your hand?
I was going to actually ask about the origins of the ambivalence and related to Palestinians, but you sort of
Okay.
already answered it. But is there anything else that any other pieces that you see in terms of the origins of that ambivalence in the 1990s? I was thinking more about any specific events or figures that start to pull, that sort of, that you would identify.
Yeah, and this is an arbitrary periodization in many ways, right? 1990. It's like when I tell students 1648 is the beginning, and they're like, oh, 1648. There are other events that one could point to as, I think, moments of unease. That 1982, Sabra and Shatila. I mean, I think had a very devastating impact on a lot of American Jews and Israelis, Jews for that matter. 87, with the beginning of the Intifada, and basically the shattering of the myth of a benign occupation for American Jews about what occupation meant. 87 was important. I think the Shamir government was, in terms of its own hostility towards some of the issues that were going on with respect to what may be a peace process. And then after Rabin's assassination and then the kind of deterioration that we've seen in the territories and the lack of a solution, I think that's just been a long-standing process that has slowly created not just simply ambivalence, but a deep demoralization, detachment in many cases. So I think those have all been important turning points. Not turning points, but they've actually it's almost like there's just layers that are increasingly being laid down that make it more and more difficult. And I think one of the, and this is no longer about policy. And I think this is the interesting question that American Jews are trying to ask. Is this just about, this goes back to your question, it's just about policies that Israel's doesn't seem to be doing enough for the peace process, but is there something else about the character of the state that is worrisome, and where policies themselves reflect not just simply exigent circumstances and sort of dirty compromises that have to be made, but rather is this reflecting something about the actual identity of the polity? I think that's what I hear people wrestling with.
We have time for one more question. So.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you.
I found the title very clever, The Star and the Stripes. But what's often most interesting is the subtitle, A History of the Foreign Policies, plural, of American Jews.
Yeah.
When you talked to various organizations, when you were doing the research on the book, would they have disagreed in terms of this history of American foreign policies and American Jews?
Oh, I'm sure. I haven't, what's that?
What other foreign histories did you bump into as you talked to people?
Well, I'm not sure which foreign policy histories would people talk about?
Yeah.
For American Jews or general?
How do other organizations interpreted foreign policy history?
Well, I think that there's a tendency to, and I don't do this, right? I mean, there could be a variety. Let me just say, the subtitle is, it's not a marketing device. I actually was ambivalent about the subtitle, but once I threw it on there, they thought, oh, this is great. People who are looking for an answer to Walton Mearsheimer will read this book now, but it's not about them. And they said, let them buy the book and then they'll figure it out. So it's mercenary. What can I say? So there is, I think, that dimension about, is this going to be the foreign policy of, and then originally it was not policies, it was policy, and I was rightly skewered for basically, potentially promoting the view that Jews are a monolithic bloc. And so the plural was designed not simply to accommodate sort of the variation over time, but also the variation in voices at a particular moment in time. And so wanting to, and that's partly true to this kind of tribalism versus particularism. The other, and the other thing that I thought was, which is a little different, we've talked a lot about Israel, and I understand that. And I'd be disingenuous if I didn't say that part of the reason I wanted to write the book was I wanted to say something about Israel, okay? But what got me into the book was not Israel, was a broader question of sort of Jewish humanitarianism And the thing that I found interesting was actually looking at Israel as a part, I say this in the book, as a part of a broader spectrum of foreign policy orientation. And seeing this as, and even, even the way, going back to the history, it was actually, some people said, well, you can't, and actually this came back through some of the reviews, you can't use foreign policy, that's only about states. You can't do that. That's a privilege of states. But then you go back and actually look at what's said about, non-state actors are oftentimes said to have foreign policies. And it was in fact interesting to go back and look at what was said about Jewish foreign policy. It was referred to as Jewish foreign policy. There was a presumption that Herzl was a Jewish diplomat. He was an ambassador for the Jewish nation. There were, this was something that was understood. I mean, and the difference was, and I think this was an entry, was that ends in 1948. You can no longer talk about Jewish foreign policy. Now it's Israeli foreign policy. Up until then, you could talk about Jewish foreign policy. Now it's Israel. So there are other ways in which you could have told the story, I think. But what I wanted to do was retain this, what I thought was a different way of thinking about sort of how American Jews have kind of tried to struggle with, their place in the world, and then that becomes the context in which I can then situate not just Israel, but the broader sense of tribalism and Zionism.
All right.